The morning he walked into his own store, Caleb Warren looked like a man the city had already forgotten. Torn jacket, scuffed boots, the kind of hollow exhaustion on his face that people instinctively looked away from. No one recognized him. Not the security guard who stiffened at the door, not the staff who turned their backs, not the customers who stepped aside like he carried something contagious. But one person did not look away. One person walked toward him instead, and when the truth finally came out, who he really was, what he had just witnessed, the ones who had acted with the most confidence were suddenly the ones with nowhere to hide. Caleb Warren had built the kind of company that looked perfect on paper. Quarterly reports that finance directors circulated without question, customer satisfaction scores that made competitors uncomfortable, a retail brand that had grown from a single storefront into 11 locations across 3 states. From the outside, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. But Caleb had spent enough years watching people perform professionalism to know the difference between a team that believed in something and a team that was simply well rehearsed. The doubt had been building for months, not in the numbers, but in the silences. The way certain managers spoke about difficult customers when they thought no one was listening. The complaints that got resolved too quickly papered over instead of fixed. Small things individually dismissible. But Caleb had learned a long time ago that culture didn't live in training manuals or mission statements. It lived in the moments no one planned for, the ones where there was no supervisor watching and no performance review attached to the outcome. So he stopped waiting for another quarterly report to tell him something he already suspected was true. The morning he chose was a Tuesday, just before the flagship store on Meridian Avenue opened its doors. He had picked that location deliberately. It was the highest performing store in the chain, the one regional management pointed to in every presentation, the one that was always held up as the standard. If the rot existed anywhere, he wanted to see it where the surface looked cleanest. He dressed in a worn jacket he'd found at a thrift store, jeans with a frayed hem boots, with the sole beginning to separate at the toe. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. He splashed water on his face, but didn't dry it completely. By the time he looked in the mirror, he didn't look like the owner of anything. He looked like someone the morning had already used up and discarded. Caleb arrived at Meridian Avenue at 8:47, 13 minutes before the scheduled opening. A handful of staff were visible through the glass, moving between displays, adjusting fixtures, going through the familiar choreography of getting a luxury retail floor ready for the day. The security guard, a broad man named Dennis, according to his name tag, clocked Caleb from the moment he stepped through the entrance. He didn't say anything immediately, but his posture changed. Shoulders, squaring chin, lifting the kind of unconscious repositioning that communicated everything without a single word being spoken. Caleb moved slowly toward a display near the center of the floor, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes moving around the room without urgency. He wasn't browsing. He wasn't exactly loitering. He was simply present, and that presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. 2 female staff members near the accessory counter exchanged a glance. A young man restocking a shelf near the far wall looked up, looked away, and didn't look back. Nobody approached him. Nobody asked if he needed anything. They adjusted their movements the way people adjust when something inconvenient enters a space. Subtle rerouting, deliberate avoidance, the kind of behavior that required no coordination because it came naturally. This was what Caleb had come to see. Not cruelty, not a dramatic incident, just the ordinary, unremarkable decision to treat a person as a problem rather than a person. He stayed near the display for several minutes, letting the discomfort in the room build around him. Dennis had migrated closer. A manager in a dark blazer, mid-40s, hair pulled back tight, the kind of expression that suggested she spent most of her day managing optics rather than people had stationed herself at the edge of Caleb's peripheral vision. She hadn't spoken to him either. She was simply waiting for him to leave on his own the way you wait for weather to pass without getting involved in it. Then someone did the opposite of waiting. She came from the direction of the fitting rooms, carrying a small stack of returned garments over one arm. 27, maybe 28, dark hair pulled back, simply wearing the standard staff uniform with no particular flair. She noticed Caleb the way everyone else had noticed him. There was no pretending she hadn't seen him, but her response to that noticing was entirely different. She set the garments on a nearby rack, redirected her path, and walked toward him with the kind of ease that suggested she hadn't calculated the decision at all. Her name tag read, Naomi. "Hey," she said, stopping a comfortable distance away, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to signal hesitation. "Can I help you find anything? Or are you just getting out of the cold for a bit? Either's fine." Caleb looked at her. She held the eye contact without flinching, without the stiffness of someone performing friendliness for the sake of it. There was nothing transactional in her expression. She was simply waiting for an honest answer to an honest question. He told her he was just looking around. She nodded, said that was completely fine, asked if he'd like some water. He said yes, mostly because he wanted to see what she would do next. She went to the back, came out 2 minutes later, with a paper cup, handed it to him without ceremony, without the particular kind of performance that people sometimes attached to acts of generosity when they wanted credit for them. She handed it over, the way you'd hand something to a coworker. Then she asked his name. He told her it was Caleb. She said it was good to meet him. They exchanged a few words, nothing consequential, the kind of small talk that exists mainly to communicate that two people are willing to occupy the same space without tension. But Caleb was paying attention to everything happening at the edges of that exchange. The manager in the dark blazer had not moved, but her expression had shifted into something that read as calculation. One of the staff near the counter had leaned slightly toward the other and said something quiet. Dennis had not looked away. Naomi noticed none of this, or if she did, she chose not to let it redirect her. She stayed another minute, made sure Caleb was comfortable, and then returned to her work without making the interaction feel like a charity moment or a story she'd tell later. She simply went back to doing her job, and Caleb stood in the middle of his own store, holding a paper cup of water, knowing he wasn't finished yet. He needed to know how long she would hold that position when the pressure started. He was about to find out. The store had been open for just under 40 minutes when the atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to actively hostile. It happened gradually, the way pressure builds in a room with no ventilation, not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small decisions that added up to something uglier than any one of them alone. More customers had come through the doors. The floor was busier now, louder, the kind of productive hum that made a retail manager feel like things were on track. And Caleb's presence, still quiet, unremarkable by any objective measure, had become the one variable that didn't fit the picture. He had moved to a seating area near the entrance, a small arrangement of chairs the store kept for waiting companions and tired shoppers. He sat with his jacket still on the paper cup, long empty, watching the floor without pretending to do anything else. Dennis had resumed his post near the door, but hadn't taken his eyes fully off Caleb. The manager in the dark blazer, whose name Caleb had since gathered from overhearing a staff interaction, was Brenda had spoken quietly to 2 employees near the register. He hadn't heard the words, but he'd read the body language without difficulty. She was managing him the way she'd manage a spill on the floor, not with urgency, but with the clear intention of making it disappear before the wrong person noticed. The whispers started not long after. 2 staff members near the accessories wall were talking in the kind of low voice that carries further than people think. One of them, the young man who had looked away earlier, said something that included Naomi's name. Caleb caught the shape of the sentence more than the words. Something about how she didn't need to play social worker on the clock. Something about how it reflected badly on everyone. The woman beside him nodded. Neither of them looked in Caleb's direction when they said it, which made it worse somehow. They weren't even bothering to address him as a subject. He had become a background detail in a conversation about someone else's poor judgment. Naomi was on the other side of the floor when this happened, helping a customer locate a specific jacket in the right size. She was efficient, attentive, doing her job well, and without visible distraction. But Caleb noticed the moment she clocked the two staff members near the wall, a brief glance in their direction, a slight readjustment of her posture, the kind of awareness that comes from knowing you're being discussed. She didn't respond to it. She turned back to her customer and finished what she was doing. Caleb watched her choose in real time to continue being exactly who she had been when she first walked toward him. That was when the door opened, and a man walked in, who changed the temperature of the entire room. He was well-dressed in the specific way that communicated money without effort. A cashmere overcoat, leather shoes that hadn't seen a sidewalk crack in years, a watch that caught the light in a way that made other watches feel embarrassed. He moved through the entrance with the ease of someone accustomed to spaces rearranging themselves around him. Brenda appeared from somewhere near the back, with a speed that suggested she had been anticipating exactly this kind of customer. She greeted him warmly, used his name, Mr. Holt, and walked beside him toward the premium section, with the focused attention she had not offered a single other person that morning. Mr. Holt moved through 2 or 3 displays with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew what he wanted and expected it to materialize without complication. Then his trajectory brought him past the seating area. He stopped, his eyes moved to Caleb, then back to Brenda, and the easy expression on his face closed into something cooler and more deliberate. "Is there a reason that individual is sitting in there?" he said. He kept his voice even, which somehow made it worse than if he'd raised it. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was communicating a problem and waiting for it to be resolved. Brenda's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She straightened slightly. "I'll have that taken care of immediately, Mr. Holt." She moved toward the seating area, and Caleb could see from across the floor the moment Naomi registered what was happening. Naomi set down the garment she was folding not quickly, but with a kind of quiet deliberateness. She crossed the floor and reached Brenda at almost the same moment, stopping just to the side. Brenda looked at her. "I've got this, Naomi." "I know," Naomi said. Her voice was level, not confrontational, but it held its ground. "I just want to make sure we're handling it the right way." "The right way," Brenda repeated, with the precise inflection of someone who found the phrase mildly offensive in the current context. "He's not causing any problem," Naomi said. "He's sitting in a chair that's there for people to sit in. That's all he's doing." Mr. Holt had not moved. He was watching the exchange with the patience of someone who expected to be obeyed eventually, and was simply waiting for the process to complete. Caleb stayed where he was, his expression neutral, taking in every detail of what was unfolding around him, with the specific attention of someone who had stopped pretending this was just an observation exercise. Naomi turned toward Mr. Holt directly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform deference, but she also didn't pick a fight. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience. If there's something I can help you find today, I'm happy to do that." It was a redirect, polite, and firm, the kind of response that acknowledged his presence without validating his demand. Mr. Holt looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who wasn't used to being redirected. Then he turned back to Brenda. "I'd like to shop without feeling like I'm in a shelter," he said flatly, and moved on toward the premium section. Brenda watched him go, then turned back to Naomi with an expression that had gone very still. "We'll talk about this," she said quietly. "After." What Caleb felt in that moment wasn't satisfaction. He had come to see how people behaved when no one with authority was watching. What he was seeing instead was something more specific and more troubling: how a system punished the one person who refused to perform cruelty on its behalf. Naomi had not been dramatic. She had not made a scene. She had simply declined to do something she found wrong, and the room was already arranging itself to make her pay for that. The "after" Brenda had mentioned arrived 20 minutes later. Caleb watched Brenda pull Naomi toward the short corridor near the stockroom entrance out of the main floor's sightline. He couldn't hear the conversation from where he sat, but he didn't need to. He could reconstruct it from what came next. When Naomi returned to the floor 6 minutes later, something had shifted in her posture, not broken, but braced. The kind of change that happens when someone has just been told that the ground beneath them is less solid than they believed. She returned to her station and went back to work. She didn't look in Caleb's direction, but she didn't avoid it either. At one point, their eyes met briefly across the floor, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not reassurance directed at him, just the private acknowledgement of someone who had made a decision and was still standing by it. Caleb thought about how that conversation in the corridor had probably gone. The careful language managers used when they wanted to threaten, without technically threatening. Phrases like optics and team consistency, and this puts everyone in a difficult position. The implication never stated directly that one bad note in a personnel file could follow a person a long way. He knew how those conversations worked because he had designed the systems those managers had learned them from, and that understanding sat in his chest with considerable discomfort. The shift in the store had settled into something cold and functional. Staff were doing their jobs. Customers were browsing. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But underneath that surface, everyone on the floor understood that a line had been drawn, and Naomi was standing on the wrong side of it, and no one was moving to stand with her. Then Brenda walked out from the corridor again. This time, she walked directly toward Caleb, and her face held the resigned expression of someone who had been given a task they intended to complete cleanly and without drama. She stopped in front of him, clasped her hands once in front of her, and spoke in the low, controlled tone of someone who had practiced this exact kind of thing. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave the store. We've had a complaint, and I have to ask you to take the rest of your morning somewhere else." She kept eye contact, kept her voice, even communicated nothing that could be directly reported as unkind. It was Caleb recognized a masterclass in institutional removal. Before he could respond, Naomi was there. She had moved fast, not running, but with the directed pace of someone who had already decided before she started moving. She positioned herself not between Brenda and Caleb, but slightly to the side, making it a three-person conversation, rather than an intervention. "Brenda," she said, keeping her voice low enough not to carry across the floor. "He hasn't violated any policy. He's not under the influence. He hasn't spoken to anyone aggressively. There is no actual grounds to remove him." Brenda looked at her. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to something that was no longer managing optics. It was direct. "I told you in there what the situation is. This is your last chance to be a team player on this, Naomi. If you can't do that, I'll need you to clock out, and we'll talk about your schedule going forward." The floor around them had gone quiet in the specific way of a room full of people pretending not to listen. A staff member near the register had stopped typing. Dennis had moved several feet closer. Two customers nearby were examining a display with unusual focus. Naomi's jaw tightened. Her breathing was controlled, but Caleb could see the effort in it, the particular tension of someone who understood exactly what the stakes were and was choosing anyway. She knew this job. She knew what the threat meant. In practical terms, shifts. Cut reviews colored the kind of slow institutional erosion that didn't announce itself, but arrived consistently until something gave way. She had no backup in that room. No one was going to step forward. The calculus of professional self-preservation was pointing overwhelmingly in one direction. She looked at Brenda steadily. "I won't ask him to leave," she said. "Not like this. Not for no reason." The silence that followed was brief and complete. Caleb looked at this woman, 27 years old. No leverage, no allies in that room, fully aware of what her answer was going to cost her. And he understood that he had reached the end of what he had come to find out. He had his answer. In fact, he had more than he'd come for. He had watched one person with nothing to gain hold a standard that an entire organization had quietly abandoned, and he had watched that same organization move to remove her for it. That wasn't a personnel problem. That was a cultural verdict, and it had been rendered clearly enough. He stood up from the chair. He stood up slowly, and something about the way he did it, unhurried, deliberate, the posture of a man who had stopped performing, made Brenda take a small step back, without seeming to realize she had done it. The floor was still quiet. Everyone was watching now, past the pretense of not watching. Caleb reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a slim card holder. He set a business card flat on the nearest display surface face up and left his hand resting beside it for a moment so that Brenda could read what was printed on it. Her eyes moved to the card, then back to his face, then to the card again. The name on it was his. Beneath the name, in clean type, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Warren Retail Group. What happened to Brenda's expression in the next few seconds was not something she could have controlled. The color left her face in a way that had nothing to do with lighting. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. The professional composure she had maintained through the entire morning, the careful language, the managed tone, the institutional precision, simply stopped functioning. She looked for the first time since Caleb had entered the store like a person instead of a role. The card stayed on the display. Caleb didn't pick it up. Word moved across the floor the way it always does in a small enclosed space, not through any announcement, but through the rapid recalibration of body language that happens when a room understands something has changed irrevocably. The two staff members near the accessories wall had gone still. The young man who had looked away and never looked back was now looking, unable to stop himself. Dennis near the door had straightened in a way that was different from the authority posture he'd held all morning. This was something closer to alarm. Mr. Holt, who had drifted back toward the main floor with an armful of potential purchases, registered the shift in the room and turned toward it with the attention of someone who had not yet processed what he was looking at. Caleb looked at all of them, taking his time. When he spoke, his voice was even, not cold, not raised, just clear in the way that voices are clear when they don't need volume to carry weight. "I'm not going to pretend this morning was a coincidence," he said. "I came in here dressed the way I did because I wanted to understand something that the numbers in my quarterly reports can't tell me. I wanted to know how this store actually treats people." He let that land before continuing. "Now I know." Nobody moved. Nobody offered a correction or a qualification. Caleb looked at Brenda directly. "You didn't do anything illegal this morning. I want to be clear about that. But you created a situation where a member of your team was threatened with losing her income for refusing to treat a person without dignity. That's a management failure, and it's going to be addressed through the appropriate process. Not here, not today, but it will be addressed." Brenda nodded once, a mechanical movement, the only thing her body seemed capable of producing in that moment. He turned then toward Mr. Holt, who had set down the items he was carrying and was watching the scene with the focused attention of a man recalculating several things at once. Caleb addressed him without hostility, but also without the deference the man was accustomed to receiving. "You're a customer, and you're welcome in any store I run, but what you asked this team to do, remove someone for the way he looked, isn't something that should happen here. I hope that's useful information going forward." Mr. Holt said nothing. He held Caleb's gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away, and the ease with which he'd carried himself since walking through the door had left him entirely. Caleb turned last toward Naomi. She was standing where she had been when he rose from the chair, slightly to the side, still holding her ground, though the tension in her posture had shifted into something harder to name. She was looking at him with an expression that moved through several things quickly. The recognition of what had just been revealed, the processing of what that meant for the last hour of her life, and underneath all of it, something that wasn't quite surprise, as though some part of her had registered without being able to articulate it, that the man she'd handed a cup of water to was not quite what he appeared to be, not because of anything he'd said, but because of the way he'd listened. "I want to say this in front of everyone in this room," Caleb said, "because it happened in front of everyone in this room." He kept his voice at the same register, not theatrical, not performed for the room's benefit, just direct. "What you did this morning wasn't exceptional because it was difficult. It was exceptional because it shouldn't have been difficult. And for everyone else in here, it was. You treated a person like a person. You held that position when it cost you something real. That's not a small thing. That is exactly the kind of thing this company is supposed to stand for, and I'm going to make sure it's recognized the way it deserves to be." Naomi didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him steadily, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but not shaken. "I didn't do it because I thought someone was watching." "I know," Caleb said. "That's the point." The rest of the morning at the Meridian Avenue store did not return to normal because there was no version of normal left to return to. Caleb spent 2 hours in the back office with documentation he had his assistant send over remotely, going through what had been recorded and what needed to be formally noted. He spoke with his head of human resources by phone, outlining the specific sequence of events with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention to every detail. The conversation about Brenda was a measured one, not punitive in the immediate blunt sense, but consequential in the way that a clearly documented management failure tends to be. There would be a review process. There would be required retraining. There would be a restructured set of expectations in writing attached to her continued role. For the staff who had whispered and looked away and adjusted their paths around an inconvenient presence, Caleb was less interested in individual consequences than in systemic ones. He had not come to punish people for being human in exactly the way that years of institutional culture had trained them to be. He had come to understand the culture, and now that he understood it, the culture was going to change. That was a harder and slower thing than firing someone or making an example in a room. It required rebuilding from the foundation, rewriting what the store actually measured when it talked about service, redefining what professionalism meant in practice rather than in a handbook. In the weeks that followed, he brought in an outside consultant to run a full cultural assessment across all 11 locations. He restructured the training program from the ground up, removing the sections that had in practice trained staff to prioritize wealthy customer comfort above everything else. He added mandatory components about dignity in service, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a practical standard, with actual accountability attached to it. He sent a company-wide communication that did not name anyone, did not sensationalize what had happened, but stated plainly that the values the company claimed to hold would now be reflected in how it evaluated its people and its managers. Naomi Brooks was offered a promotion to floor supervisor within 30 days. She was given a salary adjustment that reflected the responsibility, a formal letter of commendation that went into her personnel file, and more significantly, because Caleb understood that real recognition had practical weight, a direct line to him if she encountered anything in her new role that felt like the morning he had walked into her store in borrowed clothes and worn-out boots. She accepted the promotion. She did not make any particular ceremony of it. She showed up to her next shift and did her job at the new level with the same lack of performance she had brought to every interaction before it. Caleb left the Meridian Avenue store that afternoon through the same door he had entered. The torn jacket was in a bag in his hand. He had changed back into his own clothes in the back office, and the contrast was not lost on him. The same person, entirely different set of signals being sent to the world, and the world's readiness to respond to those signals with completely different behavior. He was aware of how long that awareness would need to stay active to mean anything. A single morning of discomfort, even a sharp one, had a way of fading into the rhythm of ordinary operation if nothing structural changed around it. He had seen that happen in other organizations, and he had no interest in watching it happen in his own. What stayed with him, past the logistics, past the personnel decisions, past the carefully worded communications, was something simpler and harder to file away. A woman had handed a cup of water to a stranger without calculating whether it was worth it. She had held that position through pressure and threat and professional isolation, not because she expected to be seen, but because the alternative required her to become someone she didn't want to be. That was not a complicated story. It was, in fact, the simplest story on the floor that morning. And it was the only one that held up when everything else fell apart. A company could run on process. It could sustain revenue on brand and habit, and the efficient execution of a repeatable system. But the thing that made people want to be inside a place, as a customer, as an employee, as a human being moving through the world, was never the process. It was whether the people operating within it had been allowed or encouraged, or at minimum, not actively discouraged from treating other people as though they mattered. Not conditionally, not selectively. Not only when the other person was wearing the right clothes or carrying the right wallet. That was the version of the company Caleb intended to build. He had needed a Tuesday morning in a thrift store jacket to remember why.